I feel like it's pretty active in there. We could go ahead and start. Do you want me to introduce you again, Sophia? I think I introduced you while you were in the waiting room.
Oh, okay.
I'll introduce you again.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Sophia is a wonderful instructor at Shoreline Community College. She teaches English and she's working on her doctoral dissertation on Samuel Beckett. And she's dipping her toes in the writing of interactive fiction. Some of her favorite genres include science fiction, fantasy, and experimental literature. So take it away, Sophia.
Thank you. Now it's my turn to figure out the technology. I'd like to share my screen, if that's okay.
Oh, I think I need to make you. Make you host.
More technical problems.
Okay, now you should be able to.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right, let's see. I'm doing this right. All right, is this working? Is there any way I can see the chat? Or do I have to open another YouTube link?
I can read what's in the chat to you if you like. I see somebody says, I'm looking forward to this. I've never written cyberpunk myself, but I'd like to see where I can incorporate it in the future. And then someone else says, we're living in an early cyberpunk world. And I totally agree. I love that comment.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, so I hope, can everyone see the slide deck? I hope so. Okay, cool. So I guess let's begin. Let's see. All right, so hello, I'm Sophia. Before we begin, I have a little bit of a disclaimer. Honestly, I don't feel like I'm an expert in the reading or writing of cyberpunk, at least at this point. So what I would like to do is to start a conversation, perhaps, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, we can maybe, if anyone has any questions, please bring it up. If there's any idea, please bring it up. Let's talk about it. That'd be really fun. Okay, here we go. So let's start with some of the basic stuff, of course. So probably most of you already know, but we'll still go over it quickly. What is cyberpunk? And then we'll move on to why write cyberpunk at all. If you're currently not writing in this genre, is there anything in here that you might be able to incorporate? Is there anything that...
We just got a request for turning on the captions.
Okay, that's a good idea. Yeah. Anyway, so first we'll talk about what is cyberpunk, and then we'll move on to talk about maybe a few reasons you might consider incorporating cyberpunk if you haven't been doing so already. And finally, some ideas to get you started, or maybe if you have already started, maybe you could, if you run out of ideas, if you're looking for new directions, hopefully this will give you some ideas or start some thoughts that will eventually direct you to those new ideas. Okay. So first of all, what is cyberpunk? So of course, it's a combination of cyber and punk. Cyber, when we think about that, we think of cybernetics, we think of information technology. And of course, this has gradually expanded to many areas of technology. Even when we're talking about cyberpunk, we might be thinking about like a more physical form of body augmentation. We might be thinking about, installing something in our mind. We might be thinking about disembodiment. Maybe we are, in the situation of hacking, we're kind of focusing all our energy and our mind onto something that is virtual and disregarding our bodies. So what at first may seem like a simple internet or computer thingy nowadays have a lot of different expansions and different influences. You could probably do a lot of different stuff with it. And when we talk about punk, when it creates an image of rebellion, challenge against the status quo, the current society, the current system. So there's definitely an inherent conflict in it. When we talk about writing stories, we're always thinking about, okay, what's the next conflict that should come into play? And cyberpunk has this pretty fluid, explosive energy already inherent in it. So that might be something you can build upon if you're thinking about next genre to write about. Anyway, some common elements, obviously, cyberpunk is interesting in that it is science fiction, but it is usually a science fiction that focuses on like people say like the next 20 years or so. At least it won't be too far away from this year. So it's a near future, more gritty, easier to speculate kind of technology than perhaps, I don't know, some kind of space travel, which is also easy to imagine, but it's kind of harder to get there. So near future technology, we have cybernetics, we have hacking, we talk about artificial intelligence, body augmentations, virtual worlds, all these kind of things that are already in play in our current today. But of course, cyberpunk usually takes it a step further and consider what will happen after a few years of this kind of development. And what comes along with that is something dystopian as well. Like usually we see these technologies or even capitalism taken to extremes. So we have post-apocalyptical, so many syllables, environments. If you look at the films, you look at the novels, in this genre, you will see a lot of like maybe a barren world, maybe it's an urban underworld, but it's trashy, full of crime, drugs, sex, all those kind of stuff. There's a lot of great class divides, obviously, because capitalism, consumerism, all these things taken to the extreme, and people assume this is what will come of it. There will also be corrupt governments or whoever the big man in charge. A lot of times this is inseparable from the mega corporations because, when technology becomes the biggest thing, like these mega corporations obviously will be taking charge. There are also often mentions of police states. So, surveillance, again, governments, all these power structures that are in place, something for our heroes to fight against. And what is also very interesting is cyberpunk is so closely related to film noir or similar detective fiction. There's usually a conflict between the authorities, maybe the government, maybe some company, and the underdogs, the criminals, the hackers. There will be murders probably, there will be heists, one or the other, or both. There will be a lot of questionable loyalties between characters. Betrayals, mercenaries, those kind of things. And kind of building on top of the dystopian world thing, the climate of this world is probably all screwed, or maybe all the things are happening inside interiors or something. So there will be a dark and brooding atmosphere. If you watch Blade Runner, remember how much smoking they've been doing in those movies. That recalls a bit of a film noir kind of atmosphere as well. Okay.
Sophia, we have a nice comment in the chat that says, I'm using cyberpunk to challenge gender norms, but usually cyberpunk is about challenging government. And I think that's really cool. That's a nice, it kind of jives with what you were saying. And I think we can use this genre to challenge things like gender norms for sure.
Definitely. I didn't really mention too much in this, but it's definitely one reason cyberpunk is so fascinating. Because you can think about it from, for instance, body transformation. That is definitely something people have been doing in terms of challenging gender norms. But that is on the more literal side, of course. When we think about challenging governments, we can also very easily link that with challenging the current body politics, obviously. So we should talk more about that in a moment. Yep. All right. Oh God, I'm nervous. That's why I'm talking so fast. Okay. So some of the common themes, usually the basic will be how might technology transform our mind, body, and society. With all this change, what remains to make us human? So obviously, I find what is interesting about cyberpunk is it often starts with the binary opposition. So we think of mind and body, like flesh and the mind. We think about the physical realm and the virtual realm. We think about human becoming more or less human, but we also have AIs and other machine life forms taking on a life of their own and challenging us and making us question what is life or what is human. So like there's all this back and forth between two extremes or two binary oppositions. And of course, what is the most interesting, what is the plot and conflict of your story comes from this somewhere in the middle of the spectrum or in this interaction of two extremes. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can do with it depending on which point you start with and where you end up with. Maybe you want to start with something that is people in power, people who are in charge of status quo, and then gradually toning it down or changing it from within. Or maybe you can go the traditional route of having an underdog hero challenging what is oppressing them. All this kind of stuff. You can write about human becoming more human, you can write about AI becoming more human, etc. Yeah, it's just interesting because I guess as humans, people, I don't know if it's an intuitive thing or part of our education that made us so attracted to binary oppositions. But cyberpunk allows a lot of these opportunities to develop and think about. Anyway, why write cyberpunk? So I guess that's a question you could pose about any kind of genre, any kind of fiction. So asking why write cyberpunk is basically one way to look at it is it's the same question as why write speculative fiction. It's definitely fun to think about, especially looking at, if you look at the news nowadays, there's so much debate surrounding how we're using technology, how technology is changing us. So it's definitely always interesting to delve into it and, you know, offer a hypothesis in that sense. Especially because cyberpunk is so close, like it usually aims for a future that is within reach, like something we can see in the near 2 or 3 decades. Yeah, it's definitely something that is closer to us than some space opera thing, which I also like, but has too wide a range to speculate. So yeah, some of its charm probably comes from how close it is to us, and how it invites us to look at our current society from a different angle. And of course, one of the most fascinating points about cyberpunk is they're usually so critical about our status quo, about the government, about our economy system, about the whole class system, etc. Maybe not system, but our current status quo, basically. It looks at how we have been maybe potentially going down a problematic path. But of course, if you take that long, look into that long enough, it might also suggest like, well, you know, there are some redeeming features. How might we get there through maybe a different use of technology, a different definition of our system, of our society, etc. So this idea of rebellion, of bringing change to the world, I think is a good reason to actually write cyberpunk or to incorporate cyberpunk elements, because it invites us, it encourages us to either critique our current situation or bring about hopeful, maybe a bit romantic, maybe a bit idealistic, but bring about a different solution. Of course, the majority of what we think of as cyberpunk is usually leaning towards the cynical, critical, skeptical side of things. And that is good too, because we always need people to remind us of how things could be different, of how screwed we are if we keep going this way. But yeah, like any of this is a chance for any writer to delve into something. Someone mentioned like gender critique, or maybe I know a lot of people have been using cyberpunk to do to work on subjects of transgenderism, of different queer politics, etc. So it's definitely a pretty fertile ground for these kind of things. I think there's also some people who work with race and cyberpunk as well, precisely because cyberpunk invites us to mix and match so many different cultures and challenge many different norms that, offers a lot of opportunities. All right, I'm just repeating myself at this point. Anyway, so yeah, cyberpunk invites us to question our current limits and maybe redefine some of these limits, or redefine some of the ways we look at things, some of the ways we take for granted, and make us think about, okay, how might we change this in the future? How might I guess that's something a lot of fiction do. But what separates cyberpunk from all these other fiction genres is how concerned with politics, with technology it is. And these are probably some of the most prominent subjects we need to, we're paying attention to these days, I guess. So yeah, again, I feel like it's just a genre that is very close to what we're concerned about right now. So it's a good place to start. But yeah, so I guess we're mostly here to think about how we can write and incorporate cyberpunk. So these are some of the ideas I've been thinking about. Of course, there are more. There's just endless things we can talk about. These are some to start us with. So the world, obviously, when you're building your world, one feature of cyberpunk is it often involves so many different worlds. Obviously, one of the most common binary opposition would be the real world and the virtual world. But virtual world, as we know, it could be like a multiverse. There could be a lot of different worlds. And of course, once we are exposed to the possibility of living in several worlds at once, then that opens up the possibility of, how do we know which world we're in? How many worlds are there? So all of these possibilities. But if you want to start with the classical, I say traditional, but it's probably not traditional. The most common cyberpunk setting is probably involves a messy, lively urban underworld. There will be a lot of bars. There will be a lot of little shops, places where you can, go for a little body modification. And all kinds of different stores that depends on what your world setting is. Maybe they have a specific resource they're lacking. I've seen people mentioning places where they can go to enjoy a fresh breath of air, because fresh air is so difficult to come by in that world. Places where they can go to enjoy something that has already disappeared from the general wilderness, our world setting. Something that might be still existing in our current society, in our current world, but it's gone for your story characters. So those might be something to incorporate. If you are starting from not the underdog, then maybe you can think about what would the government office look like? If there's a detective, what might their office look like? What might the people in charge be? What kind of world might they be living in? It's probably very different from the people on the lowest level of the pyramid. And cultural influence, I think this is a fascinating part, because in a lot of the cyberpunk films and novels, we see a lot of Asian influences, like Japan, these days probably China and Korean as well. So how would you do the same thing with your world? It's always interesting to think about what might come across as different for your readers, but makes perfect sense in that world, and may provide you with additional chances of, bringing different things that might seem alien for some people, but they're actually a deep-rooted part of someone else's culture, those kind of stuff. They will probably all come to play a part in a cyberpunk world because of the way globalism works, the way technology works. How might you incorporate those? Another thing is to look even deeper inside. We know, that really old movie Hackers, or some other works, people have been trying to build a visual metaphorical representation of the binary world, of what it looks like if you try to hack a system. How will you deal with that? Would you even deal with that? Or maybe you're more interested in like body augmentation. So how would you describe like changing the bones and fibers of a human body, for instance? Are those things you're interested in? If that is something you're interested in, that might be a pretty solid narrative or description that sets your story apart, because that's always a very interesting part when you think about it, like when you imagine it, when you try to describe it to people, how might that look like for you and for other people? Okay, so characters, obviously, I briefly mentioned, you could go with the classic route and do the underdog, the hacker, the rebel, or go with the other route, which is detectives investigating said hacker or rebel. But I've seen some cases where people are writing from the top down as well, like they're actually people in charge. Maybe something happened in the world that caused them to re-examine what they have been doing. Maybe they were placed there as spies, maybe they're there for some other reasons, and the plot happens and then they change their route. So those are some different characters you could start with. Another thing is to start with some kind of life form that is not human, AIs, or maybe certain, I think in the Matrix they have like programs that are personified. That's a pretty interesting idea as well. So robots, AIs, all these different life forms that seem human but are not by nature human. Like there will be a lot of interesting existential questions we could ask there. But one of the defining, perhaps, qualities of cyberpunk characters is that they're often broken in some way. It might just be they're corrupted in some way, but a lot of them have also suffered a lot of trauma. They might have certain things that are not in control of, their maybe in other people's control, and they have to perform a heist or something for that, to redeem themselves, to regain control of whatever they have lost. A lot of them might be addicts to maybe drugs, maybe certain technology, different resources, all those kind of things. So they might be mentally or physically broken. What kind of brokenness might your character have? And of course, think about the side characters. They could definitely, one thing about cyberpunk is you see a lot of, I want to say white collar and blue collar characters, but that's kind of a oversimplification. But basically, you could see a lot of different people from all walks of life. And being the punk genre, you could probably shape them into all kinds of shapes and colors. The more exotic, the better, maybe. I remember reading Neuromancer, like one of the opening scenes is where our main character walks into a bar and sees all kinds of different people, hears all kinds of different accents. Some people don't even look like human anymore because of the amount of augmentation they've had. So maybe you would also want to write about all these different colorful characters, all these different kinds of cultures that seem to blend together. What else? And think about what kind of occupations would be most at home there. So in the world where technology is the king, obviously there will be a lot of people who are selling it, or just carrying it, transferring it to places. Information will probably also be a big thing, without the physical stuff. Maybe they're just there to offer you what they know other people know, those kind of things. So definitely invite those characters into your story. Okay, I mentioned the machine life forms already. All right, conflicts and plots. Sorry about this first passage I have here. It kind of goes without saying. It's science fiction. You can kind of put any kind of plot into science fiction and they'll work, just add the elements of cyberpunk. But the most interesting stories obviously would come from stories that make very good use of technology, humanity, that talks about boundaries, that talk about the challenging of these boundaries, or even just reimagining what things could be with this technology and humanity. How might our views maybe views or values might change with everything going on, those kind of stuff. Like the more you can integrate it with the question of technology, of what makes us human, the better, basically. And yeah, like I previously mentioned, a lot of these will probably be, a lot of the conflicts in the story will probably be based on desires of these characters, their brokenness, be based upon the overall system that oppresses them. So if you have a pretty good world setting, it kind of goes hand in hand with all these conflicts already. Okay. Anyway, so these are some of the prompts I sometimes use for myself when I don't know what to write about in my stories. So pick a new story and rewrite it into a cyberpunk narrative. This doesn't always work for other genres, but I feel for cyberpunk it works pretty well. Like just pick up your newspaper, your online news source, pick an article you're somewhat interested in, and rewrite it in a cyberpunk world, in a cyberpunk setting. So for instance, we know all the weird stuff Facebook is up to these days, or maybe, I don't know, Amazon. Or even Apple, all these different tech companies, that's one place to start. But think also to not just the technology and its implications, but also like political systems. Maybe the party you are supporting have some things you find questionable despite your supporting of the party. Maybe there are some politicians doing something silly, as always. Any kind of stuff like politics, economy, even the stock market, technology, or even slice of life stories, right? Like maybe you read in the neighborhood something happened. Is there any way you can make it into a cyberpunk story or like a part of that story? Maybe there's this person you see walking on the road that inspires you, like, what would this person be like in a cyberpunk setting? So basically you can draw from all those different nearby sources. The next one, pick an ideology and cyberpunk it. So, you know, for instance, capitalism, communism, or like, well, I would say existentialism, but that is already part of what cyberpunk is about. But anyway, pick some system of thought, pick some political ideal, anything, any kind of thought, and think about how it might work in the cyberpunk world. How will the technology transform it, or how will it transform technology? Like, how do they influence each other? Those are also quite worth thinking about. The last one is kind of a lazy one, but you can always pick a technology and imagine how it might be developed in the near future. One thing I have done is to think back to something that has become obsolete these days and reimagine, like if in an alternate universe, that thing actually survived and got further development, what would it look like? So, you know, with a lot of old things like, I don't know, videotapes, cassettes, there are some wacky inventions somewhere in the past that somehow just never took flight. So dig some of those up and see what you can do with it, right? Like imagine maybe something took the place or is now developed alongside the internet, for instance. What would that look like? Yeah, if we have like, if it's an in-person time or if you have a chance to like have discussion groups, this would be what I would ask everyone to do and discuss. But since we're on YouTube, I would say just feel free to use these if you run out of ideas or if you want to do something different for a change from your usual routine. Yeah. Okay, but to sum it all up, for me, how I approach cyberpunk is to first think about what binary oppositions there are, and then try to think about how these two binary oppositions can come into play with each other and explore the spectrum in between. So, when we talk about the maybe technology and nature, that's not like a strict binary opposition, but think about certain binary oppositions, the authority, the underdogs, um, the law, the criminals, like all these kind of different things. And think about how you can make them play against or with each other. Think about what comes from this struggle, this conflict, or even how to break it, how to break these binaries. Maybe technology provides a way for us to combine them or make these different binaries obsolete. So yeah, those are a few points of starting points for you to start with, actually. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so far I've been sticking with like kind of a very general level. So please throw questions at me, and maybe we can all discuss together. If you have any questions or ideas, or if you want feedback on a certain story idea, we can probably talk about that too.
I'm going to let people think about this. It looks like we've attracted some new viewers, and I'm going to let everybody think about questions. But one thing I get asked a lot is, and you already touched on this a bit, is how to write diversity into a story without tokenizing the person or doing it in such a way where it's offensive. And I think when you touched on how cyberpunk has it does steal a lot of Asian influences, and there's a lot of terrible ways to do that. But yeah, I would personally love to hear more about that, because you did already touch on it, and it's something we all think of when we think of cyberpunk, is the noodles and the noodle stand and the flashing lights and the just kind of very Tokyo feeling cities. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about what you think about that.
Oh, okay. That's a challenging question because I struggle with that too. It's so hard to write about like a different culture and not, because I would always question myself, like, do I understand it enough? Like, am I representing it in a like fair way? Am I just adding it for a sense of, either because it looks exotic or because I want to add certain flavors to it? Those kind of things. Yeah. Do I have a good answer on the spot?
And even if you don't, just the fact that you have considered it, and it's definitely, something that we should all kind of consider when we take our stories into account. I do have a question. Perhaps cyberpunk can be used to comment on how culture can be monopolized and commodified for profit. That's a great suggestion. Yes. And comment. Yeah. And yeah, question. Definitely.
Yeah. I think commodifying not just culture, but a lot of different things is always also, and maybe it's not always the focus, but it's kind of in the background for a lot of cyberpunk works. Like when we think about the Matrix, for instance, like what it commodifies is not nature, but like it's such an interesting word because the plot itself, the content itself, seems to argue against the danger of like embracing technology too much. But the movie and its all this special effects, they seem to be celebrating technology. Kind of see the same thing sometimes with how they deal with, say, capitalism. Like a lot of these works are criticizing capitalism taken to the extreme, but in some ways they are still part of the capitalist system, like or consumerist system. Like we're still like people are still writing novels to sell them, or like there are other ways they are still embracing capitalism in some form or aspect. So yeah, like I guess the challenge in this is it can definitely be used to criticize how culture has been commodified, but it's also so difficult sometimes to avoid falling into the same trap.
And I like this comment. We just got a comment. Even gender as cyberpunk highlights the objectification of women and even men as sex objects. Perhaps that can be used as a criticism of the sexual objectification in our own world.
Yeah, I like that thought a lot. Definitely. So again, this brings the question of how we interpret things. Like on one hand, for me, one of the things in one of the class I taught, one of the topics that came up was Ghost in a Shell. Is the director objectifying women? Because one way we can look at it, the protagonist, she is like, I guess she counts as a cyborg. So we can kind of see how, okay, she defies a lot of gender norms. She goes against the grain. She is strong enough to deal with everything on her own. But at the same time, you could see there are a lot of boob shots, panty shots, those kind of things that celebrate, you could say they celebrate the woman body, but you can also argue that it's an objectification of women. And it's even worse now because the woman body is actually combined with cyborg parts. So now it's actually object aside from the flesh. So yeah, you can really make all these different kinds of arguments. And I wonder as writers how we can actually, well, it depends on if you feel like the writer is dead and we should not care too much about it. But yeah, as writers, how do we deal with this? How, when we encounter this kind of potentially very different interpretations, how will we present our characters, our stories to, hopefully make it work the way we intend? Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
I think that's a very optimistic perspective. And I think we can change the way people think with literature. And the way that you're kind of framing this makes me have hope for the future, that especially that Ghost of the Shell, I'd never seen it that way. And now I think when we bring it into the light, we can make sure that future literature and future writers are more aware of it. So we have future writers in our chat right now, and I'm so pleased that they're going to write Cyberpunk because I can't wait to read it.
Yep.
Okay, and we have another comment. It must be done in a way that does not celebrate or fetishize. Criticism should not hypocritically pander. For example, we can show how objectification affects women and even men without objectifying. Great comment.
Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely the ideal. Yeah. I guess another thing we might struggle with in the terms of writing cyberpunk is that fetishism seems to be another common inherent element in a lot of cyberpunk works. Like in Neuromancer, we have this meat puppet thingy. We have people who, well, maybe not in Neuromancer, but in some other cyberpunk works, like people who mutilate their own bodies for the sake of money, for the sake of, well, sometimes for art, but mostly for money. Like all these kind of objectification and fetishism, like they seem to play a big role in cyberpunk. Obviously, we hope, or we can read it as like criticism against these kind of situations. But yeah, at the same time, they seem to be so prominent. And yeah, again, makes me question sometimes whether we are still propagating it, like even as we criticize it.
Great points for sure. Well, I don't see any more questions or comments in the chat. I just want to make sure that I say thank you to Sophia, who spent this time with us. And I'm going to put this video on the library YouTube channel. So if you missed the beginning and you want to go back and watch the beginning, I'm going to add it to the YouTube channel for the Ray Howard Library. And thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I'll let Sophia say bye too, but I just want to say bye first.
Bye. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really interested in what you would all come up with. Like what I heard about the gender and the medieval approaches, like those sound really interesting. I wonder if the library will give us a way to share all our works. That'd be awesome. Yeah. So,
I think we could do that. I think we would love to hear about your novels. So I'll make sure there's a way for if you put your comments in the comment section of the video, I'll make sure to highlight it at our library.
Looking forward to that. Yeah. Yeah. So just thank you, everyone. I do have some additional resources you can look at, but basically they're just TV tropes links. I know they may be a bit basic, but sometimes after like submerging oneself in writing for so long, it's sometimes refreshing to go back to look at the simpler stuff and look at what else we might have missed. So if you haven't checked out the TV tropes pages on Cyberpunk or on whatever genre you're writing, it's a good resource to go back and look at just for fun.
Sophia, Allison says, I would love to see links to your work if you want to share, which I can put in the description of this video if you want to share those. And then Steve Bogart and Allison says, this has been great. Steve Bogart says, thank you so very much, Sophia.
Thank you.
Yes, I can put these two links in the description box when I publish the video.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I currently have anything to share, but I will share with the library once I have something. So thank you so much for your interest. Yeah. Okay. So
yay, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, and Sophia has allowed you guys to email her directly. So if you have any follow-up questions, here's her email address at the college.
Yeah. Yeah, so let me know if you have any further questions or comments. I would love to read them. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna stop.
Okay, have a good night.